The murders didn't continue because the system was blind. They continued because the system was overwhelmed and patterns take time to emerge. For several years, nothing about this case seemed urgent. There were no dramatic crime scenes, no single moment that demanded national attention, no clear signal that something extraordinary was unfolding. Instead, there were disappearances that looked unrelated, deaths that appeared isolated, reports filed in different jurisdictions at different times under different assumptions. And inside that fragmented landscape, one man, Joel Rifkin, continued killing. Not because he outsmarted law enforcement, not because he left no evidence, but because the system meant to connect those events was under pressure long before his crimes were ever linked. In this analysis, we're not going to retell the case as a horror story. We're not here to amplify fear or to mythologize violence. Instead, we're going to slow the story down. We're going to look at how ordinary routines can hide extraordinary harm, how repetition can appear invisible when viewed in isolation, and how silence in the record-missing data, delayed connections, unshared information becomes part of the story itself. This is not a story about a criminal mastermind. It's a story about timing, about limits, and about how violence can persist quietly when no single failure feels large enough to demand immediate attention. By the end, we will know what the law was able to prove. We will also be clear about what it could never fully explain. And we'll sit briefly with the uncomfortable truth that understanding a case does not always bring closure, but it can still bring clarity. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, New York City and Long Island existed under a constant sense of pressure. Crime was not an abstraction. It was part of the daily rhythm of life. Violent crime rates were high, media coverage was relentless, and public anxiety had become normalized. People learned gradually to live alongside danger rather than constantly react to it. At the time, this did not appear unusual. Law enforcement agencies were stretched thin. Patrol officers responded to an endless stream of calls. Detectives managed overwhelming caseloads. Resources were finite, while the demand for immediate response was not. Investigative work was often reactive rather than anticipatory, focused on the crime directly in front of them, not on patterns that might only become visible months or years later. There is nothing in the early record that demands immediate alarm. Disappearances occurred regularly. Some were reported late. Others were never formally reported at all. When a person vanished, the initial assumption was rarely homicide. Adults were presumed to have left voluntarily. Some were believed to have relocated. Others were quietly categorized as transient. In a region, this large absence alone did not automatically signal danger. This is where background violence begins to matter. When violence is constant, it becomes contextual noise. Individual cases are processed in isolation, evaluated on their own facts, and then filed away. A single death may appear tragic, but contained. A missing person report may seem unresolved, but not extraordinary. Without a clear immediate link between events, each case remains compartmentalized, and compartmentalization delays recognition. Investigators at the time were not ignoring victims. They were responding within the constraints of the moment. Each department operated largely within its own jurisdiction. Communication across county lines was slower and less systematic than it would later become. Digital databases were limited. Information sharing depended on manual processes, phone calls, and personal familiarity between offices. This mattered more than it seemed. A pattern does not announce itself fully formed. It emerges gradually across time and geography. And when crimes occur in different locations, involve different victims, and leave different physical evidence, the connective tissue can remain invisible for far too long. The difference between an individual tragedy and a recognizable pattern is often not intent, but accumulation. One death is processed as a singular event. Two deaths may still be coincidence. Even several spread across years and counties can appear unrelated, especially when the victims come from populations already marginalized by society. Their disappearances may not trigger immediate institutional urgency, even when they trigger private grief. From an investigative standpoint, this is not negligence. It is structural reality. Police departments are built to solve cases, not to anticipate unknown ones. They respond to what is reported, documented, and immediately actionable. Pattern recognition requires time data and the ability to step back from urgency, all of which were in short supply during this period. So the environment remained deceptively calm. Nothing about the city suddenly changed. No single event disrupted the rhythm of daily life. The streets were already loud. The headlines were already crowded. The system was already busy responding to yesterday's violence. And within that environment, something more sustained was taking shape quietly, incrementally, and without spectacle. At the time, it did not look like a larger story. It looked like many small ones. Only later would those fragments begin to align. When investigators and the public later tried to understand this case, there was a natural impulse to search for something visibly abnormal at the center of it. A sign. A warning. Some outward marker that would explain how such violence could exist undetected. The difficulty is that the record offers very little of that. Joel Rifkin lived a life that on the surface appeared unremarkable. He resided with his mother. He worked a series of modest labor-based jobs. He followed routines that were consistent and predictable. There were no public displays of aggression, no known history of dramatic confrontations, and no social persona that suggested volatility. To neighbors and acquaintances, he blended in. This is not unusual in cases of sustained hidden violence. Normality often functions as camouflage. When daily behavior aligns with social expectations, going to work, returning home, maintaining basic routines, it reassures those around us. It reduces scrutiny. It encourages assumptions of safety, not because safety has been proven, but because danger is usually imagined as disruptive or chaotic. In this case, there were no obvious outward markers typically associated with threat. There is no early record of arrest for violent crime, no documented episodes of public instability, no evidence of escalating behavior that would have triggered mandatory intervention. If warning signs existed, they were subtle enough to remain indistinguishable from ordinary social withdrawal or personal difficulty. And that distinction matters. Equating violence with visible deviance creates blind spots. It teaches systems and communities to look for danger only where it announces itself loudly. But many offenders do not announce themselves. They adapt. They comply. They occupy social spaces that feel familiar enough to escape sustained attention. The danger then is not that Rifkin appeared normal. The danger is how heavily systems rely on normality as reassurance. From an analytical perspective, it is important to separate what the record shows from what it does not. The record shows routine, employment, residence, repetition. It does not show early intervention points that were clearly missed. It does not document complaints from neighbors, employers, or family members that demanded action and were ignored. This absence should not be mistaken for failure to care. Rather, it reflects the limits of prediction. Many traits later associated with violent offenders, social isolation, difficulty forming relationships, internal fantasy life are also present in countless individuals who never commit harm. Without behavior that crosses a legal or institutional threshold, there is little for systems to respond to. This is where pattern recognition becomes essential, and where it often arrives too late. The system was not ignoring a monster. It was failing to see a pattern forming in plain sight. Each piece of Rifkin's life viewed independently appeared inconsequential. a job change, a quiet home life, solitary habits. None of these alone justified concern. It is only when viewed alongside other data, across time, across victims, across jurisdictions, that meaning begins to emerge. But meaning requires connection, and connection requires data communication and the ability to step back from individual cases to see cumulative behavior. During this period, those capacities were limited, not absent but constrained. In retrospect, it is tempting to search for the moment when this could have been stopped sooner. The record does not offer a clean answer. It suggests instead that violence can persist not because it is invisible, but because it is unremarkable when examined in fragments. What appears ordinary repeated long enough and left unconnected can become profoundly dangerous. At the time, there was nothing about this individual that demanded immediate alarm. Only later would the accumulation of acts give that ordinary life a different meaning. Reconstructing the timeline of this case requires restraint, not because information is entirely absent, but because much of what we think we know comes from sources that are by nature unstable. The distinction between confirmed events and narrative gaps is central to any responsible analysis. The record confirms that the first homicide formally attributed to Joel Rifkin occurred in 1989. The victim was identified. The location was documented. Physical evidence supported the conclusion that a homicide had taken place. At that point in time, however, the crime appeared isolated. There was no immediate indication that it belonged to a larger sequence. Over the following years, additional deaths occurred. Some bodies were recovered. Others were discovered months later, sometimes in fragmented condition, sometimes in locations far removed from where the victim was last seen. Each recovery generated its own report, its own case number, and its own investigative track. The record confirms certain dates. The record confirms certain locations. The record confirms cause of death in several instances. But the record does not confirm continuity. That continuity emerged later largely through confession. And this is where the narrative becomes less stable. Rifkin ultimately confessed to multiple killings extending beyond those for which he was formally charged. These admissions shaped public understanding of the case, but they also introduced uncertainty. Confessions are not neutral documents. They are shaped by memory, by fear, by perceived advantage, and by the psychological needs of the person giving them. We don't know whether every confessed act occurred exactly as described. In some instances, confession filled gaps where physical evidence was limited or degraded. In others, it introduced new claims that could not be independently verified. Some locations described by Rifkin aligned with recovered remains. Others did not. Some timelines appeared plausible. Others raised questions about overlap, travel, and opportunity. Beyond this point, documentation becomes inconsistent. This inconsistency is not unusual in cases involving multiple jurisdictions and extended timeframes. Records were not always centralized. Evidence standards varied. Communication between agencies was uneven. As a result, some events are anchored firmly in documented fact, while others exist primarily in narrative form. The analytical challenge is knowing where to draw the line. Confessions can clarify motive and method, but they complicate chronology. They often collapse time, compressing years into a single narrative arc. An offender may remember acts in sequence without remembering precise dates, or may misattribute details from one event to another, or may unconsciously reshape the story in ways that feel coherent to them, even if they are not strictly accurate. This is why retrospective certainty has limits. When investigators attempt to reconstruct a long series of crimes after the fact, they are working against entropy. Memories fade. Physical evidence deteriorates. Witnesses forget or reinterpret their experiences. What remains is a mixture of hard data and interpretive narrative. The record confirms the date of the final arrest in 1993. It confirms the circumstances that led to that arrest. It confirms the presence of a victim at the time. From a legal standpoint, that moment anchors the case. It provides a stopping point. But between the first confirmed homicide and that arrest lies a span of years marked by partial visibility. We don't know whether some deaths attributed to Rifkin will ever be conclusively linked. We don't know whether the full sequence can be reconstructed with precision. We don't know how many events remain undocumented entirely. What we do know is that the timeline we have is not a single clean line. It is a series of fragments, some solid, some uncertain, held together by later interpretation. Understanding this distinction matters. It reminds us that the story we tell about a case is not the same as the case itself. The case exists in reports, evidence logs, and court records. The story emerges later, shaped by memory confession and the human need for coherence. In this analysis, we move forward carefully, marking where the record is firm and where it falls silent, because those silences are not flaws in the story. They are part of what the case truly is. When the available cases are placed side by side, a set of behavioral consistencies begins to emerge. These consistencies do not announce themselves dramatically. They appear quietly through repetition. And repetition in behavioral analysis is rarely accidental. The record indicates that Joel Rifkin selected victims from a narrow and consistent social context. The individuals he encountered were accessible to him often through brief transactional interactions. This did not require deception on a grand scale. It required familiarity with environments where brief contact was normalized and questions were limited. This pattern matters. Victim selection is rarely random. It reflects opportunity-perceived risk and the offender's comfort navigating a specific social space. In this case, the selection suggests an individual who understood where scrutiny was low and where absence might not immediately trigger coordinated concern. That understanding does not imply intelligence in the cinematic sense. It implies learning through repetition. Across the confirmed cases, the method of killing shows limited variation. The record repeatedly points to manual strangulation. This is not an impulsive method. It requires proximity. It requires sustained physical contact. And it unfolds over time rather than in an instant. From a psychological perspective, repetition of method is significant. When an offender returns to the same method, it suggests emotional regulation rather than emotional overflow. Rage-driven violence often escalates shifts or fractures under pressure. Here, escalation is notably absent. There is no progression toward more public acts. No shift toward faster or more destructive means no indication of loss of control at the moment of the act. Instead, the violence appears contained. This containment suggests that the act itself served a specific internal function. The goal does not appear to be chaos or spectacle. It appears to be control. Control over the environment. Control over another body. Control over the timing and aftermath of the act. The spatial dimension reinforces this interpretation. The crimes occurred within geographic zones that were familiar to the offender. Disposal sites were chosen for accessibility, not for symbolic meaning. They reflect knowledge of roads, industrial areas, and places where objects could be left without immediate discovery. This suggests comfort rather than improvisation. Spatial familiarity reduces anxiety. It allows the offender to operate without cognitive overload. That reduction in anxiety is consistent with the absence of erratic behavior during or after the crimes. Importantly, there is little evidence of behavioral escalation over time. This absence matters because escalation is often interpreted as a hallmark of serial violence. But escalation is not universal. In some cases, repetition itself becomes stabilizing. The offender refines rather than amplifies. The behavior becomes routine, even procedural. We don't know whether the lack of escalation reflects satisfaction with the method or fear of detection. We don't know whether internal fantasy evolved over time. The record is largely silent on internal motivation. What we can say is that the external behavior remains remarkably consistent. Consistency does not mean simplicity. It means predictability within a narrow range. And predictability is often the result of learning what works, what does not attract attention, what can be repeated without immediate consequence. At this point in the analysis, a shift occurs for the listener. The violence no longer appears chaotic or impulsive. It appears structured. Not meticulously planned in advance, but organized enough to be repeated. The acts fit into the offender's life, rather than disrupting it entirely. This is an important turning point. It suggests that the crimes were not moments of emotional collapse. They were episodes integrated into routine. That integration is what allowed them to continue for as long as they did unnoticed by systems designed to respond to disruption. The absence of escalation, the repetition of method, and the use of familiar space all point in the same direction, a form of violence that functioned quietly, predictably, and within boundaries the offender understood. At the time, those boundaries were invisible to others. Only later would repetition reveal the structure beneath what once appeared as isolated acts. In cases like this, there is a risk that victims become reduced to shorthand descriptions. Labels replace lives. Patterns replace people. That reduction may make analysis easier, but it comes at a psychological cost, both for understanding the case and for honoring those who were lost. The individuals killed by Joel Rifkin were not interchangeable. They were not abstractions. They were people with routines, relationships, and histories that existed long before their final moments. They were known to someone. Each victim moved through daily life in ways that made sense within their circumstances. Some maintained regular contact with friends or family. Others lived more transient lives shaped by economic pressure, unstable housing, or limited social support. These routines mattered. They determined where a person was last seen, who noticed their absence, and how quickly concern turned into action. Their absence was noticed, even if not immediately acted upon. For families and friends, disappearance does not arrive as a single moment of certainty. It unfolds gradually. Missed phone calls, appointments that go unanswered, days passing without explanation. In many cases, loved ones sensed that something was wrong long before the system formally acknowledged it. Social marginalization complicates this process. When victims belong to populations already viewed as unstable or transient, their disappearance is more likely to be interpreted as voluntary. Investigative urgency is shaped often unconsciously by assumptions about lifestyle. Reports may be delayed. Cases may be classified differently. Leads may be prioritized elsewhere. This is not always the result of explicit bias. Often it reflects institutional triage under pressure. Law enforcement must decide where to allocate limited resources. Those decisions are guided by risk assessments, probability, and precedent. When a disappearance does not immediately resemble a crime, it may not receive the same attention as a case with visible signs of violence. Over time, this creates uneven pathways through the investigative system. The psychological cost of this unevenness is significant. For families, silence in the record becomes its own form of trauma. When updates stop coming, when calls are not returned, when a case appears to stall, uncertainty hardens. Grief has no structure. Hope and fear coexist without resolution. The absence of information can feel like an erasure not only of a loved one's fate, but of their importance. From an analytical standpoint, invisibility also distorts pattern recognition. When cases are processed in isolation, connections remain hidden. Each victim's story becomes a separate file rather than part of a collective narrative. This fragmentation delays the recognition of serial behavior, especially when victims share social vulnerabilities that reduce institutional visibility. Societal labels shape investigative pathways long before conclusions are drawn. They influence how quickly a disappearance is taken seriously. They affect how aggressively evidence is pursued. They determine whether a case remains active or quietly recedes into backlog. None of this requires malicious intent. It emerges from structure, workload, and cultural assumptions operating together. It is important to be precise here. Acknowledging these dynamics does not diminish the responsibility of the offender. Nor does it suggest that victims were less worthy of protection. It explains how systems built to manage risk at scale can fail individuals whose lives do not fit neatly into expected patterns. When we return to the victims as individuals, the case changes shape. The timeline becomes more than dates. The gaps become more than missing data. They become periods of unanswered waiting. They were known to someone. They were missed. And their absence mattered long before it became evidence. Understanding this does not solve the case, but it deepens our understanding of how violence persists when lives are rendered partially invisible, not because they lack value, but because the systems meant to protect them are uneven in what they can see. This recognition is not an emotional detour. It is central to understanding how the case unfolded the way it did. In many violent crimes, the most revealing information appears after the act itself. Not in the moment of violence, but in what follows. What the offender does once the immediate goal has been achieved often tells us more about psychological state than the act of killing alone. In this case, the record indicates that Joel Rifkin did not immediately flee after the offense. He remained with the body. Time passed. Decisions were made. These are not behaviors associated with panic or disorientation. They suggest a capacity to tolerate proximity to what he had just done. Staying with the body matters. For many offenders, the aftermath triggers acute anxiety, fear of discovery, physiological stress, or dissociation. That response often leads to hurried disposal mistakes or impulsive flight. Here, the record points in a different direction. The offender appears to have been able to remain present to plan next steps and to act deliberately rather than reflexively. This capacity implies a relatively high tolerance for post-offense anxiety. The dismemberment and disposal of bodies further reinforce this interpretation. These actions required time, physical effort, and sustained focus. They were not necessary for the act of killing itself. They were necessary only for managing what came afterward. Importantly, there is no indication that these acts were performative or symbolic. The record does not suggest ritual messaging or expressive excess. Instead, the methods appear functional. Bodies were altered and transported in ways that reduced immediate detection and allowed the offender to move through familiar spaces without drawing attention. This functional quality is significant. It suggests that the violence, while severe, was contained within a broader framework of control. The offender was not attempting to erase what had happened in a psychological sense. He was managing it. The body became an object to be handled, moved and concealed, rather than something that provoked visible distress or collapse. Transport and delay are also revealing. The movement of remains across locations, sometimes over extended periods, required patience. It required the ability to resume daily activities between actions. There is no evidence in the record of abrupt withdrawal, sudden disappearance from work, or attempts to isolate completely following the crimes. We don't see signs of flight behavior. There is also no indication of suicidal ideation immediately following these acts. No documented attempts at self-harm. No statement suggesting loss of meaning or desire for self-destruction. Instead, the offender returned to routine. Work continued. Daily life resumed. This contrast is important. In some cases, violence is followed by collapse, psychological or functional. Here, the opposite appears true. The offender's ability to reintegrate into ordinary life suggests that the act of violence did not overwhelm his internal structure. It did not destabilize him in ways that demanded immediate resolution. This does not imply emotional absence. It implies compartmentalization. Compartmentalization allows incompatible realities to coexist. Extreme violence on one side, ordinary routine on the other. The transition between them does not require spectacle or explanation. It requires only boundaries and the ability to maintain them. At this stage in the analysis, a key insight becomes clear. The offender's calm after the act contrasts sharply with the violence itself. That contrast challenges common assumptions about what violent offenders should look like after committing a crime. There is no visible unraveling, no dramatic behavioral shift. Instead, there is continuity. This continuity helps explain how the behavior persisted. It also helps explain why it remained difficult to detect. When violence does not disrupt the offender's outward life, it leaves fewer signals for systems designed to respond to disruption. The absence of panic flight or collapse becomes part of the camouflage. The record does not tell us what the offender felt internally during these periods. We don't know whether anxiety was present and managed or largely absent. The record is silent on subjective experience. What it does show is behavior, and behavior suggests stability, not chaos. Understanding that stability is essential. Not to normalize the violence, but to recognize how it can exist quietly sustained by routines that appear from the outside entirely ordinary. In long-form investigations, absence can be as consequential as presence. Missing data does not simply slow an inquiry. It reshapes how a case is understood, remembered, and emotionally processed. In this case, the gaps are not incidental. They are structural. The record is silent on many early moments. Reports are incomplete. Some files end abruptly. Others contain only minimal information. Names, dates, locations without narrative context. In several instances, documentation exists without follow-up, leaving no clear indication of what actions were taken, if any, after the initial report was filed. No documentation indicates a comprehensive effort to link cases across jurisdictions in real time. This silence is partly explained by how investigations were organized during the period in question. Departments operated within defined geographic boundaries. Information flowed vertically within agencies more easily than it flowed horizontally between them. When a case crossed county or city lines, continuity depended on individual initiative rather than system design. Unlinked jurisdictions matter because patterns do not respect boundaries. A disappearance in one county and a body recovered in another may never be placed side by side if no centralized mechanism exists to connect them. Without shared databases or standardized reporting, similarities remain anecdotal. What one investigator sees as unusual may never reach another who is holding a complementary piece of the same puzzle. The record is silent on how often these near connections occurred. There was no centralized digital tracking capable of aggregating missing persons, unidentified remains, and homicide data across regions. Much of the work relied on paper files, phone calls, and personal memory. These methods function under low volume. They struggle under scale, and scale was very much present. From a psychological standpoint, missing data has different effects on different groups. For families, silence becomes a second loss. When records thin out and updates stop coming, time stretches without markers. Grief has no narrative to follow. Hope persists in fragments while fear fills the spaces between official communications. Families may continue searching long after institutional attention has shifted elsewhere. The record is silent on the private labor of that waiting. For investigators, incomplete data produces a different strain. Working with partial information requires constant recalibration. Leads cannot be fully pursued. Hypotheses remain tentative. Over time, uncertainty hardens into limitation. Cases are not closed, but they are no longer actively moving. No documentation indicates malice in this process. It indicates constraint. Investigators must prioritize. New cases arrive daily. When evidence does not advance, attention shifts not because the case no longer matters, but because the system must keep functioning. This creates an environment where unresolved questions accumulate quietly, without ceremony. Public memory is shaped by these same absences. Cases with clear timelines, visible suspects, and dramatic resolutions tend to persist in collective awareness. Those marked by silence fade, not because they lack significance, but because they resist narrative completion. Without updates, without names, without closure, they become difficult to hold on to. The record is silent on how many people remembered these victims years later. Missing data also distorts retrospective understanding. When a pattern is finally recognized, it appears sudden. But that suddenness is an illusion created by gaps in documentation. The events did not accelerate. Our ability to see them did. This distinction matters. It reminds us that investigative clarity is not only about intelligence or effort. It is about infrastructure, about whether information can move, accumulate, and be compared before time erodes its usefulness. No documentation indicates that these silences were intentional. They were procedural. In the context of this case, missing data does more than obscure facts. It shapes emotional outcomes. It determines who waits, who remembers, and who is eventually named. And it reinforces a difficult truth when records fall quiet. Violence does not disappear. It simply becomes harder to see. Understanding the meaning of that silence is not about assigning blame. It is about recognizing how absence over time becomes its own form of evidence. To understand how this case unfolded, it is necessary to step away from individual decisions and look at structure. Not at moments of error, but at the conditions under which decisions were made. When viewed this way, what emerges is not a story of dramatic failure, but of limitation. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, investigative caseloads were heavy and unrelenting. Detectives were responsible for dozens of active cases, at once often spanning violent crime, missing persons, and unresolved deaths. Each new report arrived with urgency. Each demanded immediate attention. Time, however, did not expand to meet demand. Caseload volume shapes behavior. When investigators are overwhelmed, triage becomes unavoidable. Cases with clear suspects, cooperative witnesses, or immediate public risk rise to the top. Others move more slowly. This does not mean they are abandoned. It means progress becomes incremental, dependent on new information, rather than sustained pursuit. Resource limits compound this effect. Personnel shortages, overtime constraints, and administrative burdens all narrow the range of what can be done proactively. Investigative work that requires long-term pattern analysis, cross-referencing, or interagency coordination is often deferred, not because it lacks value, but because it lacks immediacy. Technology at the time imposed further boundaries. There was no centralized digital infrastructure capable of seamlessly linking missing persons reports, unidentified remains, and homicide data across jurisdictions. Records were largely paper-based. Databases, where they existed, were siloed. Searching across systems required manual effort and institutional permission. This matters because patterns depend on comparison. Without tools that make comparison efficient, recognition slows. Investigators rely on memory intuition and chance encounters methods that work unevenly at scale. The system functions, but it does so with friction. Cultural and social factors also influence investigative momentum. Bias does not always operate overtly. Often it appears through credibility, hierarchies' assumptions about which reports are reliable, which witnesses are dependable, and which victims are likely to have encountered harm versus chosen absence. These hierarchies shape how quickly a case moves and how much institutional energy it receives. This is not unique to any one department or era. It is a feature of systems operating under pressure. When time and resources are limited, decision-making shortcuts emerge. Some are explicit. Others are embedded in policy precedent and professional culture. Over time, these shortcuts can produce blind spots not because anyone intends harm, but because complexity exceeds capacity. It is tempting in retrospect to frame these outcomes as failure. Hindsight exaggerates expectations. It assumes that patterns obvious now should have been obvious then. It overlooks the fact that clarity is often produced only after accumulation, after years of data confessions, and forensic advances bring fragments together. At the time, those fragments were scattered. Investigators did not see the whole picture because the whole picture did not yet exist in any one place. It existed in pieces distributed across files, offices, and memories. The system was responding to each piece as it appeared, without the benefit of future context. This is where reframing becomes essential. What happened here was not a collapse marked by alarms or public reckoning. It was a quiet erosion of visibility, a series of reasonable decisions made under constraint, each defensible on its own collectively produced delay. Systems rarely fail loudly. They fail gradually. They fail through overload rather than negligence, through fragmentation rather than blindness, through the slow accumulation of unanswered questions that no single moment demands to be resolved. The key insight, then, is not that the system missed something obvious. It is that the system was not designed to see what this case required it to see at the speed it required. Understanding this does not excuse harm. It contextualizes it, and it reminds us that prevention is not only about sharper instincts or better intentions. It is about building structures capable of holding complexity before silence has time to settle. Systems collapse quietly, not dramatically. The legal conclusion of this case arrived without drama. There was no prolonged pursuit, no carefully staged operation, no final confrontation shaped by months of anticipation. The arrest occurred through routine enforcement, an ordinary traffic stop that revealed something extraordinary. The record confirms that Joel Rifkin was taken into custody in 1993 after police stopped a vehicle for a minor violation. What followed was not the result of a long-term strategic breakthrough, but of circumstance and proximity. Inside the vehicle, officers discovered evidence that immediately shifted the encounter from routine to irreversible. From a legal standpoint, this moment matters because it marks the end of uncertainty. It provides a clear transition from investigation to adjudication. The system, which had struggled to connect events across time and geography, finally had a single, undeniable anchor. What followed was procedural and deliberate. Rifkin was charged, tried, and convicted for multiple counts of murder. The court proceedings focused on what could be proven physical evidence, corroborated timelines, and testimony that met evidentiary standards. Ultimately, he received a sentence that amounted to life imprisonment, multiple consecutive terms designed to ensure permanent confinement. The verdict confirms responsibility. It establishes beyond reasonable doubt that Rifkin committed the acts for which he was charged. It provides legal recognition to victims whose cases had remained unresolved. It allows families, at least in part, to move from uncertainty to acknowledgement. But the verdict does not explain origin. Legal outcomes are not designed to answer psychological questions. They do not reconstruct internal motivations, developmental pathways, or emotional states beyond what is relevant to culpability. The court's role is not to interpret meaning, but to determine responsibility within defined parameters. This distinction is important. There is often a public expectation that a conviction will bring understanding. That once a name is attached to a crime, the story will make sense. In reality, legal clarity and psychological clarity operate on different timelines, and sometimes on different planes entirely. The trial record remains largely silent on why these acts began when they did. It does not explain why they continued. It does not resolve how internal experience translated into repeated behavior. From an analytical perspective, restraint is necessary here. Speculation beyond the record risks replacing evidence with narrative convenience. It is tempting to fill gaps with assumptions to assign cause where only correlation exists, or to interpret silence as meaning. But responsible analysis requires acknowledging where information ends. We don't know what internal triggers preceded the first offense. We don't know how the offender interpreted his own actions over time. The record does not provide access to subjective experience. What the legal outcome does provide is boundary. It defines what the system can conclusively say and what it cannot. It marks the point at which action replaces uncertainty, even if explanation remains incomplete. It also demonstrates the limits of institutional response law can contain behavior, but it cannot fully translate it into understanding. For families, the sentence offers a form of finality. It confirms that the person responsible will not return to public life. It may offer relief validation or a sense of safety restored, but it does not necessarily offer peace. Questions often persist long after the courtroom empties. For the public, the conviction can create the illusion of closure. But closure is not guaranteed by verdict. It is a psychological process, not a legal one. And in cases marked by long periods of silence, that process may remain unfinished. The legal outcome is essential. It is also limited. It answers the question of responsibility. It does not answer the question of how such violence took shape within an ordinary life, nor how it remained undetected for so long. Those questions remain outside the scope of the court. They belong to analysis reflection, and inevitably to uncertainty. Recognizing that boundary is not a weakness of the story. It is one of its defining truths. By the end of this case, the facts appear settled. A name has been established. Responsibility has been legally confirmed. A sentence has been imposed that ensures permanent confinement. From the outside, the story seems complete, and yet completion is not the same as understanding. What we know is limited, but solid. We know that Joel Rifkin committed multiple acts of homicide over a span of years. We know that these acts followed consistent behavioral patterns. We know the methods used, the general circumstances of the crimes, and the point at which the system was finally able to intervene. These facts are supported by evidence testimony and court records. We also know how the system responded once clarity was achieved. Investigation gave way to prosecution. Prosecution gave way to conviction. In that sense, the process worked eventually. What we infer is more tentative. From behavior, we infer control rather than chaos. From repetition, we infer emotional regulation rather than impulsive rage. From post-offense conduct, we infer compartmentalization rather than collapse. These interpretations are grounded in observed actions, not speculation, but they remain interpretations, not conclusions. They suggest tendencies, not certainties. And then there is what remains unknown. We don't know why the first act occurred when it did. We don't know what internal shifts preceded it. We don't know how the offender understood his own behavior as it continued. The record is silent on internal experience. It does not grant access to thought fantasy or emotional meaning. Even extensive analysis cannot recover what was never documented. There are also unknowns on the systemic side. We don't know how many connections came close to being made and fell short. We don't know how many moments of concern existed privately before they surfaced institutionally. We don't know how different outcomes might have been under different structural conditions. These gaps are not failures of effort. They are features of complexity. At this point, it becomes important to restate the purpose of analysis. Analysis is not an attempt to solve what cannot be solved. It is an effort to understand how behavior unfolds within context and how systems respond under pressure. It asks not only what happened, but how it was allowed to happen, and what that reveals about human behavior and institutional design. Understanding behavior helps us move beyond caricature. It resists the temptation to frame violence as incomprehensible or alien. Understanding systems helps us move beyond blame. It shows how ordinary constraints, time, resources, structure shape extraordinary outcomes. Neither form of understanding offers closure, and that is not a flaw. Analysis does not replace closure, but it helps us recognize patterns before they repeat. It helps us see how violence can exist quietly embedded in routine, how harm can persist without spectacle, how silence in records, in data, in response can become meaningful in retrospect. For families, unanswered questions may never fully recede. For investigators, unresolved details may remain professionally unsettling. For the public, the story may feel incomplete. That incompleteness deserves to be acknowledged, not smoothed over. Some cases end with certainty. Others end with containment, not comprehension. This is one of them. The value of returning to it lies not in reopening wounds or chasing explanations that do not exist. It lies in learning how easily systems can overlook cumulative harm and how important it is to attend to what appears ordinary, fragmented, or quiet. Because not all violence announces itself, and not all understanding arrives with answers. Sometimes the most honest conclusion is to sit with what remains unresolved, aware of its weight, attentive to its lessons, and cautious about assuming that every story can or should be neatly finished.